The problem with supply chain is that everything we do is so dependent on so many things. I guarantee you that every one of your companies has a global supply chain. Things come and cross borders, you cross time zones, you cross cultures. So therefore, the things that affect you come from everywhere. They come from left field. It's not just things that you control. In fact, the things that you should worry about are the things that you cannot control or even influence. And those are the things that give you a problem. That's hard to think about. And one way that I find it easy to think about, or a framework, is something called STEEP. I don't know how it translates into Spanish, but it stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. It's a way of thinking about things that could influence my supply chain. So let's just go through this, and I'm going to start with social, because this is something that we think as supply chain that really doesn't affect us. Things in the social side. When in fact, demographics have a huge impact on what we do in supply chains. Think about the aging workforce. This is a huge problem in Japan, a huge problem in Europe, United States, not so much here in Latin America, but in many other areas. The workforce is getting older, so you see more automation, and your consumers are getting older, so they're changing what they want. Also the mores, the things that people find acceptable. This picture is from Massachusetts in 1910. Child labor, working at the clothing mills. Child labor is becoming more and more something that you just don't do. This is changing the way that manufacturing happens. So social forces can come on and change the way your supply chain needs to operate. Let's move to technological. This is the easy one. This is the sexy one, right? These are the things that are out there. This is autonomous trucks, blockchain. You have to talk blockchain whenever you come to a conference these days. Drones, robots in the factories, e-commerce, 3D printing, and Internet of Things, IoT. Those are, I think, a Google Home, an Alexa, and different things that communicate directly back with the vendor. These are the easy ones, to be honest. These are the things that are going to disrupt your supply chains in the most obvious way. And so, but we have to think about these things and all these technological things coming and changing, but more importantly, no technological change will have an impact without a corresponding social change. Let me give you an example drawn from my youth. Back when I was 16 and had hair, all that I wanted to do, well, most all that I wanted to do, was collect records. I had, if you're of the age, you recognize what that is, right? A record player, a long-playing LP, and a CD. I had hundreds of these. Then around the turn of the century, I said, you know what? Let's go digital. So I owned, on iTunes, I owned the digital copies, but I still owned it. I still owned the thing. I could take it away and do whatever I want with it. But about 4 years ago, something interesting happened. I started going to Spotify. And now I don't own any music. I'm streaming. So it's migrated from not just physical to digital. That's one change, but the real change from ownership to renting, to service. So I don't own any music, and I'm perfectly happy with that. And I found out actually earlier that the city with the most number of Spotify users, does anyone know? It's Mexico City. I had no idea, so fun fact. But then also you can look at other things, cars. Again, when I was 16, all I wanted was a car. And now, not so much these days, it's changed. But then you go into Zipcar, Car2Go. These are sharing services where I still drive. And then we know the story. Lyft, Uber, many other vendors out there. What's the big shift? Well, the technology is there, but without the corresponding social acceptance, it just doesn't happen, right? And so priorities are shifting from ownership to access to the thing. So we're shifting from nouns to verbs. I don't need a car. I need mobility. So it's changing the way that we think about and consumers think, and it's changing the way that you have to run your supply chains. Running a supply chain for maintaining vehicles that only utilize 10% of the time is different from them being utilized at 90% of the time. So this could have dramatic implications on your supply chains. Let me keep going. Economic. These ones are pretty easy. Think about taxes, think about tariffs, think about inflation. You don't control them, but they change what you do, right? As taxes, as inflation goes up, it changes your inventory holding policies. And so we all know how your investment decisions will change based on these economic factors. Environmental, it's not just pollution. It's not just pollution and what you create into the environment, it's the availability of resources. If you're a brewer, your number one resource that's scarce is water. Right? How do you get access to clean water? And so this is changing the way supply chains are set up. And also, you're seeing more companies that are being pollution neutral and energy neutral. And it's driving, because of this, And then finally, political. This is the one we all hate. The one thing that's common in all countries, we tend to not like our own politicians and the rules that they create. And so every country has its own regulations. I put down here from something as simple as truck size and weight, down to the annual minimum wage, labeling that you have to do, which keeps changing. So if you're providing products from one country going to many, labeling will be different for every one of them. And then in the top, I have the number of pages in the U.S. Federal Registry for registrations. It keeps going up. So all of these things combine where things are coming from left field that change the way you have to do supply chain, and it's very uncertain for you because you don't know where it's coming from. But sometimes you see things come from multiple locations. Let me give you an example. So we think about global warming, and that initially started as a technological thing. We started looking at this and finding it, and then it turned into a social thing where suddenly there was more social awareness for this and eventually drives to regulation. We see this a lot. We see this in data privacy, GDPR in Europe. It moved from a social movement to regulations. We see it in the modern slavery acts in California, in London, and other places where it moved from social awareness into regulations. So one thing you might want to start doing is paying attention to some of the social causes that are out there, even if you don't agree with them, because chances are they will find their way into a regulation. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they come down the pike. So there's a lot of uncertainty here, and the future's uncertain for us as supply chain managers and executives because it comes from so many places. Next thing I want to convince you of is that we as humans are bad at predicting. So let's go and talk about how we plan, planning for the future. And any good supply chain manager in demand forecasting knows how I forecast depends on how far I'm forecasting out. So if I'm looking at next month, next quarter, next year, then I probably want to use a simple mathematical method, whether it's exponential smoothing, ARIMA, moving average, any kind of pattern matching that says, okay, what's happening around me today, right? Take out the anomalies, and then I project forward. I box. I'm boxing forward for my prediction. And if I'm good, I give a range. So it's not just a point, it's plus or minus. So I have a range forecast. But they're all the same, even machine learning. It's pattern matching. It's saying what's happened in the past is going to happen in the future, and I can project. It's boxing. The question that we have to ask is, what about long term? Can I box my way 5, 10, 15 years in the future? When I give this talk to governments, I do 15 to 20 to 25 because they have to plan for infrastructure that lives that long. For companies, 2 years is long term sometimes, but let's just say 5 to 10. And so I would argue that you cannot box your way that far in the future. I think those methods work very well for 1 year, quarters, couple months, but not for the very long term. And this picture explains why. This is from Shell. I use this a lot. It's been out there for a while. And what it's showing is the actual price of oil in 1990 in dollars per barrel. That's the dark line. And each of the colorful lines coming off are the consensus forecasts of the price of oil going forward. Usually in a smaller group, I ask, what do you notice? And someone usually says, the forecasts are all wrong. It's always a safe statement to say that. Forecasts are always wrong. The interesting thing is how they're wrong. So 2 things to notice. The first, every one of the projections is a box. It's boxing, right? It's a linear projection up. Second, notice that the slope, which is the rise over the run, right? Steep slope, shallow slope, steeper. The slope is steeper when it's volatile. So in the 1980 time frame, it's very volatile, going up. Therefore, price is going to keep going up. When it's a stable period, price is going to stay like this. This is showing the human fallacy that we all have, and I'll go into this in more detail in a second. And for interest, the price of oil today is right around $60 a gallon, $60 a barrel, rather. And so that would translate into about $30 per barrel in 1990 dollars. So actually, the forecasts aren't wrong. They're not bad. A bunch happened in the middle, but where we are today, it's actually not that far off. But so we are bad at planning at the future. And why are we so bad? I would argue it's because we're what's known as provincials in time. A provincial is someone who never leaves the valley of where they grew up. It's someone with a narrow point of view. It's a countrified sense of view. It's being limited. So you stay close to where you grew up. This is also related to some technical biases, something called recency or availability bias. If you can remember something, you tend to think it is higher probability, which really doesn't make sense. If something happened recently, you tend to give that a higher probability than something happened further back in the past. And so we're all these provincials in time. And that's the problem that we have as supply chains that we need to overcome. We need to think bigger than just our own valley of time. Because that's all that we're doing when we box. We're looking at what happens around me, and I'm projecting, I'm boxing. So, what does it mean to be a provincial in time? 3 ways that it manifests itself. The first, we look to the future with today's lenses. The second, we think the way it is today will go on forever. Things don't change. We can't help it. This is the way we think. And the last one is we forget how we got here today. We look backwards and we say, oh, it's obvious that we're doing what we're doing now and using what we're doing now. It's just obvious how it is, when in fact, it wasn't at the time. All right, so hopefully you all agree future's uncertain, and that we as a race, as humans, are horrible at predicting. So what do we do? Well, I'm going to give you 3 recommendations, 3 tools, 3 things that you can use, and I'll give you my contact information at the end. You can always send me information if you want more. First, you need to change your thinking from events to effects. I'll explain that. Try scenario planning, and then select and monitor sensors in the ground. So changing your thinking from events to effects. So who remembers in 2010, gosh, it was 9 years ago now, almost to the day, the eruption of this volcano in Iceland that I used to be able to pronounce. Let me try, and I'll drive the translators crazy. It's Eyjafjallajökull, the volcano. Who remembers when this happened? So a volcano that wasn't expected to erupt did, and the net effect was it stopped all cross-Atlantic transportation for several weeks. And so the question is, did anyone was able to predict that? No. It wasn't in anyone's contingency plan ahead of time. But what do you think was in everyone's contingency plan the next year? Everyone had a volcano plan, right? Because of recency bias. But the point is, you couldn't predict this, but you could plan for something. There are other things that would have the same effect. Not the event, the same effect. For example, there could be a trade war. There could be a medical issues. There could be a plague or some kind of infestation. Something that causes that there is no flow across the Atlantic. The last time this happened, where cross-Atlantic transport was restricted, anyone know when? It was World War II. Let me give you another example. The Olympics in China, 2008. That wasn't unexpected. We knew that was going to happen. But what we didn't expect was what Beijing was doing. They were closing down a wider and wider range of manufacturing because of pollution. And so all of a sudden they extended about 100, 150 miles out of Beijing, where most latex rubber gloves were manufactured. And all of a sudden that stopped. And so you talk to executives from like Subway or stores that use a lot of rubber gloves for making sandwiches and things. They were hit really hard. There's a huge shortage. So this is the whole point. You cannot predict events. So what I have here, this is a list actually from General Motors of all the potential events that can happen, bad things. And if you can read it, I mean, it's arson, theft, loss of key personnel, workplace violence, animal infestation. I mean, there's a million things here, right? And guaranteed if your company's big enough, something on this list happens every day. You just don't know which one, right? And so you will never be able to plan and forecast all those, but what you can do is boil them down and boil them down into effects. And there are 5 big effects, and there might be some other ones, but most companies have 5 big ones. Some event will change 1, how I source, where I source my materials. 2, where my product is going to, my flow destination. 3, how it gets there, the routing. Think about the volcano. 4, the volume, it might increase or decrease the volume. And then the impact on value density. And that's just a proxy for the type of product moves. So for example, if you think about the iPhone coming online, what's the big impact to your supply chain with the iPhone? And one of the impacts is it gets much more dense, so it has a higher value density. So you're going to be shipping less product of higher value, which means you're not going to ship it by ocean, right? You're going to ship it by air. It's going to change the way you do things. So this is a very powerful thing. Instead of boiling the ocean of all the different events that you can't predict anyway because you're human, you have the effects. Which ones will affect me? How will it affect me? And so this allows you to filter and it helps you prepare for any event. If you can boil down, well, these common events, if they happen, they will have the same effect. So now we're going to the future where the scenario planning. Sorry, I have to catch my breath. Scenario planning, we started with this and we said, okay, the way that you forecast depends on your horizon. And we said if it's 1 quarter, 1 month, 1 year, boxing is okay, but longer term it isn't. And the question is, what do we do differently? And the whole idea is that you should shift from trying to predict to preparing. So instead of boxing your way out, instead you say, hey, if the future looks like this, I would react like this. If the future's like this, I would react like this. So you're moving from boxing to judo. Now the problem is we don't know what futures to go, right? So this is taken from Star Trek, Next Generation, and it shows the view from the USS Enterprise of looking out, and there's all these future worlds out there, future enterprises of futures that could happen. This is what you see every day. It's not just science fiction, right? So if you look at all the futures you have, you cannot possibly prepare for every one of them. So there is a technique called scenario planning that helps you come down and come out with extreme solutions. You look at the driving forces and you pick 3 to 5 scenarios that cover the feasible region of that future. All right, last one. And this is look at sensors in the ground. So when you finish these scenarios, you're going to come up with things across the groups that you set up. Some things are going to be perfect, good to do in every single one of the scenarios. Some of the things are going to be stupid to do in every one of the scenarios. So you don't do those at all. Those are no gainers. But there are going to be some that say, you know what? It makes sense in this scenario. It makes absolutely no sense here. Right? So think about, 3D printing. You might have a scenario where there's a lot of 3D printing in local manufacturing. And you might have another scenario where no, things get centralized. And so the idea of having a lot of bulk transportation probably doesn't make as much sense in one versus the other. So this is what's known as a contingent implication. And so now you need to know, okay, when should I decide to go to strategy A or strategy B? And this is a sensor in the ground. You start paying attention to more things. Oh, thank you. Thanks. You start paying attention to more things that you don't normally pay attention to because, again, we're in supply chains. So what affects you could be something that's happening in China right now. So getting your team to think beyond and paying attention, okay, what are the things that we need to think about that'll help us understand how to prepare for the future? For example, the whole data privacy, GDPR in Europe, came about because of some law student was in a lecture about 6 years ago and got really upset by what one of the tech executives was saying about what they do with people's data. And so if you're paying attention to that, you can start preparing your systems, because now, no matter where you're operating, you're going to have to follow some of those rules. And so what one company did, this was a major brewer that we worked with, they developed 3 scenarios based on what people like for consumption of different beverages. And what they tied it to is actually different things that are driving each of those. And so they said, okay, what's driving us to one scenario or another is, for example, the scarcity of water. And so therefore we need to start paying attention to X. And they started paying attention to a bunch of different things, and they tied this into their strategy playbook that they now update. And this is what they use to determine what should I put my R&D, my research and development money in for 3, 5, 10 years out. We did this project with them, and they uncovered that they were very poor at delivering in very dense urban areas during events. And so they started a project up at MIT with our megacity logistics lab, understanding better ways of distributing their product in very quick events in very dense areas. So it helped them determine what they wanted to do going down, because that became one of the driving forces for them going forward.